The format for today is that we're going to do a presentation, and I think we've got about 40 minutes or so scheduled for the presentation, and then we're going to have a very short period, about 5 minutes or so, for you to start sending your questions in, and then we're going to have a Q&A session for about 20 minutes or so. I am Dan Cook. I'm the head of data policy and development here at HESA, and I've been working with the team that's aiming to deliver the Data Futures platform, doing a lot of the data development work that's required, and I'm the spokesperson for that much larger team that's put together these key concepts and the related data model. I'll come on to other things that we're going to do towards the end of the presentation, but for the moment we're just talking about key concepts that we think it's important to understand going into the data futures world. So this is output from the detailed design part of the project. The detailed design took all of the feedback that you gave us from the collection design project, which ended in the spring this year, and we've been working through all of those details to understand some of the issues, some of the concerns that people raised, and to refine and develop the model. And what you've seen published recently is the result of all of that detailed design work. That's work from both people at HESA and colleagues at Civica, who are our development partners on this project. So first of all, let's talk about the scope of the collection. The scope of the collection covers 3 existing collections. So we've taken 3 separate data collections and essentially translated them into a single collection. And we've expressed that translation in a sector-owned observed data language. You may remember from the HEDIT project, we did a lot of work on trying to understand what are the key concepts that are involved in data reporting around students and how do those concepts relate to each other. We developed a data language, and we've attempted to express the requirements of those 3 data collections in a single collection. So it's not the same concepts are necessarily represented, then there's not a one-to-one mapping. As with any active translation, you're taking the meaning and the sense of one language and you're expressing it in the idiom of another, and that's exactly what we've done with these 3 data collections. So it's something new, it's quite heavily changed from what you've seen before, but in terms of the mandate, the underlying reasons why we're collecting the data and the definitions of what's important, those remain kind of the same. So the mandate is the same, the language is different. Details of the entities and fields to be collected are presented in the data dictionary in the coding manual, and you can find that in the collection section of the website, which forms the core of the publication that we put out a couple of weeks ago. And the specification, and I'll just move on to that. The specification is a consolidation of the concepts and structures that have been refined over the past 2 years and which are now largely stable. So we think that what we've put out is a good basis for people to start the detailed preparations for data collection from. And if I just bring that up on the screen, this is a simplified, almost conceptual level. Our data architect has just made a shuddering noise at me. I probably shouldn't have said the word conceptual. It's a simplified version of the data that's included, and if you look at each of the entities there, you'll see lots of familiar friends and lots of items of data that relate very closely to the business processes that you will have in your institution. So the collection scope, I think that covers the type of data that's included. We will be offering some further training or webinars on the data model in due course. We've got some developing plans to be able to show you in more detail how that model is made up, and we'll be publishing details of that shortly. Let's move on to the collection schedule. So we're moving from a system of discrete and retrospective annual data collections to a model of continuous data collection. This is what we do at the moment. We have an annual cycle. You in your institution do some data capture for the year of interest, and then you validate that data, and then you start sending it to HESA. There's a process whereby we get to the stage where you can commit the data, and then we do data quality checking, and essentially it's a kind of race to the finish line, which I know many of you will be intimately familiar with, and the aim is to sort of fill that bucket of data to get perfect data at the end of the year, and that's served HESA and the sector well for 25 years, but it's a very old-fashioned way of collecting data, and it's not really fit for purpose in a world where we all expect more timely data. So our new process is more like this. It's continuous data collection and continuous quality assurance. Data is related to events, so if nothing happens during a period, nothing needs to be returned, but if something happens, then something needs to be returned. So for instance, student and personal characteristics and information about courses need only be returned once. It's not that you have to be in an annual cycle of returning the same sorts of data. Once you've told us about something, we'll remember it. 3 reference periods every year ensure consistent comparable data can be produced for a wide range of public purposes. So once you've returned the data that you know it exists in terms of the courses that you're offering, and those bits of information about students as they start, those are held in the system, and then really you're just adding to and updating the information about exactly what the students are studying and any changes to their status, changes to their funding and monitoring data, that kind of thing. So this is a very different model, and if I put the two models side by side, you'll see there's really quite a different approach. The first has an annual cadence, the second has whatever is the appropriate cadence for your provider. So what this means is that HE providers have the option to smooth resourcing and increase the efficiencies that are available to them if they choose to adopt best practice in data management, by validating data close to the point of capture, and by sharing new or changing data with HESA as small updates which will be processed automatically. Now, we recognise that there are lots of different journeys that HE providers are on towards improving the way that they manage data, and so collection can still be managed through bulk file uploads, whether through regular updates or through bulk updates towards the end of each reference period, treating that as though it were an old style commit deadline. And for those who require it, a data entry tool will also be available. But it's pretty clear from the shift that we're making from an annualized process to an always on continuous process that institutions really get to obtain efficiencies if they start thinking about supply of data to HESA as an extension to their normal business process rather than as a separate business process in its own right. And we want to create a system that enables you to leverage that value and to smooth resources in your institution. Let's move on to reference periods. I've got a few slides about reference periods. So a definition, what is a reference period? A reference period, and you can see it there on your screen, is a fixed period of time, the end of which aligns to when HESA statutory and public purpose customers require sector-wide data and information. And I should say, each reference period has the same coverage. So the coverage of the data that I showed you back a few slides, if I just take you back to that one, it's the same coverage for every reference period. It's not 3 separate collections a year that each have a different flavour. Every item of data is potentially within coverage each reference period. It just depends what changes from one reference period to another. So going back to the reference period, each reference period is designed to sort of fit within the times when we know that data is generally required, and we've published the dates, but I'll tell you what they are now. So the dates of the 3 reference periods are from the 1st of August through to the 31st of November, the 1st of December through to the 31st of March. Did I say 31st of November? 30th. That's yeah, that's how many days November's got. I know my year. So from the beginning of December through to the end of March, and then from 1st of April through to the end of July, 31st of July. So 3 equally sized 4-month periods, and the year divided into thirds in that way. So you can think of that as the period of interest. It's similar in many ways to the idea of a HESA reference year, but with one really crucial difference, that we're not interested in you tying your business processes into HESA's view of a year. It's just a convenient place at which to sort of pause and say, at this point we require data to be brought together on a sector consistent in a sector consistent way in order to supply useful, meaningful data to all of those customers for data about higher education that are so hungry for in-year data. And that includes institutions themselves. So the reference period is that and no more. Data Futures model sees data as a natural output of your own business processes, and so submission of data should ideally follow in close proximity to business events such as registration, progression and graduation. So the reference periods are not deterministic. I can't say this often enough. The model is designed to follow the generally annual rhythm of course deliveries, recognising that different courses operate on different timescales. Business events occur and generate data. They occur. The collection system is always open, and HE providers can continuously submit, quality assure, and view consolidated data using the Data Futures platform throughout the year. And a suite of quality assurance and sign-off activities enable us to provide the sector with reliable, comparable and consistent in-year information. So reference periods are contiguous, i.e. they share a common border, date range, that defines the data that's in scope for validation and for sign-off. A reference period is followed by a dissemination point, which defines the deadline by which the data must be signed off. So why did we choose these periods? Well, we chose them because they align to the traditional academic year. It's still a common timetable that affects the majority and reflects the majority of activity in higher education, and reflects the sort of principal regulatory activities that depend on data at the moment. But the flexibility of the model allows HE providers to reflect their own timetables of activity and represent the different delivery patterns of courses with different start dates. So there's no concept of a type year, for instance, in the new model. In the reference period runs up to the dates that I mentioned, but that doesn't mean that that's the last data that can be submitted for that reference period. So if I just move on to the next slide, HE providers complete their submission of data for the reference period, I mean hopefully by the end of the reference period, but actually following that period the consolidated data for that reference period is brought together. HE providers have an opportunity to preview and correct, if necessary, that consolidated data supply for the forthcoming dissemination point. And so this is analogous to the period post-commit, when we are aiming to develop data towards a credible state. It's not quite the same though. So we're looking for providers to sign off their data at least once during that period. You can sign off as many times as you like, but it needs to be signed off at least once. But essentially at the dissemination point, the data will be published. And what that means is that there is going to be a set of published dates by which the data in the state that it's currently in will be published. We'll come on to dissemination points in a little bit more detail in a moment. Let me see. Okay. Yeah, so I think that's fairly clear. I think I've explained the process well enough. Just checking my notes to make sure I've not missed anything for you. So in any case, a detailed definition of the processes following the reference period has been developed during the detailed design phase. We're going to pilot this approach during the alpha and beta pilots, and we'll be adapting the approach if necessary, and feeding back to the sector as we learn more. But essentially, that's how a reference period works. I hope that's clear enough for you. Let's go on to some of the other things that we mentioned as part of reference periods. So sign off. What happens during sign off? So we finish the reference period and we are in that space before the dissemination period. So sign off means the process of a defined role, which will usually be the Vice Chancellor or Principal, making a formal declaration that the in-scope data submitted to HESA represents, and these are carefully chosen words, an honest, impartial and rigorous account of the HE provider's events up to the end of the reference period. And those words, honest, impartial and rigorous, you'll recognise from some of the work that we've done on developing a code of practice, and those are the same standards that those who are using the data are going to be asked to sign up to as well. So that in a very real sense, we're asking everyone to act in an honest, impartial and rigorous way as peers in a quality assurance process. Anyway, it's a slight digression. So it's an account of the provider's events up to the end of the reference period. That could include some things that have happened prior to that reference period. So we're asking for all of the data up to the end of the reference period that's in scope for sign off to be signed off. And you can sign off data as many times as you deem necessary until the deadline is reached. As long as we've got signed off data, then we'll assume that it's usable at the dissemination point. Obviously, if it hasn't been signed off, then there's nothing to use at that point. We'll talk about exactly what is being signed off in a moment. So in-scope data signed off during the sign-off process is not necessarily the same as all data submitted since last sign-off. That's because you may be submitting some data to us that refers to a period in the future, or that is simply not in scope for sign-off for whatever reason, and we'll come on to that in a moment. The other thing to say is that sign-off will be an electronic process, and we're developing a sort of secure document signatory system as part of the data features process, whereby those signatures can be gathered from the appropriate individuals at providers. Okay, so from reference periods and sign-off to dissemination point. So what happens at the dissemination point? As I alluded to before, this is the specified date, and we will be publishing dates, but we haven't done so yet, following the end of a reference period by which signed off data will be extracted and supplied to HESA's data customers. Data disseminated at the dissemination point will be used for official accounts of the higher education provider's activity for statistical, regulatory and public information purposes. So essentially these are the points when we are going to be saying this is a picture of the sector with its data mustered together in a comparable way that can be used for the very wide range of purposes that are expected of national HE data. That means that if we've got signed off data, it can be used. If there's no signed off data at that point, clearly there wouldn't be any data to use. That could be problematic if there are processes that matter to you that depend on the data, but the principle is that will be a date that's published and everyone understands what has to be done by that date. Now at the moment we haven't published those dates because we need to check through alpha and beta exactly what kind of length of time is reasonable. We've got some assumptions which I'll come on to, but we want to make sure that we get that dissemination point right and that it's well understood, and we're just not quite ready to publish those at this stage. But you know the reference periods, and you can assume that sign off will be expected fairly promptly following the reference period. So it's going to be a process that follows immediately on the heels of the end of the reference period. How immediately and how many days, weeks, months is still to be determined. So they've not yet been finalised. They'll be refined through alpha, but as a rough guide only, we've been anticipating that the dates would be something along the lines of these, and that shows that during at the end of a first reference period during business as usual, we might be looking at a relatively short period. So thinking about the majority use of data at that time, mainly the policy interest is going to be around new entrants into higher education and getting that data as early as possible, because of course we don't know that data until much later at the moment. There's a second for the second reference period of the year, we're anticipating somewhere around a month and possibly a bit longer, up to 2 months or so, for the end of the year reference period, where we're sort of closing down records and progressing students and so on. So that's our sort of rough thinking at the moment. It's in no way finalised, and we'd be grateful to receive feedback on how practical that would be for you given the shape of your curriculum. So the collection system will always be open. Data is submitted following business events, and then you can update. You can submit updates at any time. So in effect, the work of submitting data to HESA becomes one of continual submission of changes in the form of new and updated data, and quality assurance gets spread throughout the year. So even though we've got these 3 reference points and we're talking about some kind of process not dissimilar to the post-commit attainment of credibility prior to sign-off type process, actually the things that are going on during those periods will depend a lot on what data is actually needing to be quality assured. So it may well be that you've previously told us quite a lot of information about the students or the courses that they're studying. So the volume of data that might be quality assured at those points might actually be a little bit lower. So we need to test that out and see how that works in practice, and we will do that through alpha and beta. Sign-off is prior to the dissemination points, as I've said, but one other point that I wanted to make, which is that at the moment we think of each collection year as producing a record, and we refer to them C17051 and as a distinct bucket of data that represents that year's worth of activity, but in future there will only be one student record, and this record accumulates over time. So new data that is in scope will be signed off after each reference period, and what happens is that data gets added to this single longitudinal data set. So one student record, open all the time, and essentially we can cut that into years or reference periods or any appropriate division that's practical. It's also worth saying that there will be some kind of mechanism for exception processing, and when that occurs, that's about rectifying previous errors or omissions, and I'll come on to that a little bit more in a moment. And just another health warning on that slide, dissemination points are still only indicative at this stage. I've mentioned the term in scope, so let's talk a little bit about in-scope periods. The in-scope period is a recognition that we are now in a world where timeliness is a quality factor alongside completeness, consistency, accuracy, and so on. And the in-scope period is the duration for which each entity is relevant for sign-off by a HE provider. So every entity has an in-scope period, and that in-scope period is based on the in-scope start date and an in-scope end date formula, and those define when that row of data comes into and out of scope for validation and sign-off. So when a reference period overlaps the in-scope period, it's defined as being in scope for that reference period, and that means that an entity can be in scope for more than one reference period. Any data that's submitted prior to the in-scope period will not require sign-off until it becomes in scope. So you can submit things that you know ahead of time, but they won't necessarily, even if you know them to be true, such as planned curriculum, that you have no intention of cancelling, there's no question that it will run, that wouldn't come in scope until that activity actually sort of the in-scope dates for that planned curriculum overlap with a current reference period. And at that point they fall into scope. So the way to think about it is that every entity has a formula that determines when it starts being in scope and when it stops being in scope, and those formulas tell you when the data is going to be required in which reference periods. So what this means is, and I mentioned exception processing before, if you're returning data about an entity that is no longer in scope, then that's subject to a form of exception processing. Exception processing I'll come on to in a moment. So why have these in-scope periods? Well, in-scope periods acknowledge the fluidity of data. They enable older data to fall out of coverage naturally. They allow data of interest to be identified, and they enable future data to be submitted without needing to be subject to sign-off. So with in-year reporting, timeliness becomes a quality dimension alongside validity, completeness, uniqueness, and in-scope periods enable quality assurances to operate in real time instead of thinking about data as being a project where we're aiming to get the perfect data set, filling that bucket of data. Perhaps a better analogy would be to say, instead of trying to fill a bucket with data each year, we have a continuous stream of data, a continuously running tap, if you like, and the new processes need to be fit to be able to give you timely, useful information about to aid your quality assurance processes in that running stream. So it's a different kind of idea, and in-scope periods support that. In general, to give you an idea of how we're going to set the in-scope periods for each entity, we will be publishing these soon, but we haven't finished working through them yet. In-scope periods for each entity will be set in general with a start date relative to a relevant curriculum related or student related start date, and with the end dates generated from the anticipated arrival of new data. So for instance, if a student is attached to a course delivery, and we know that student has completed the first course session, well, we're going to be anticipating that there's going to be some data about that student starting the next course session, and let's say that the student, we don't get an update by the end of that second course session to say that the student has finished, whether successfully or unsuccessfully. Well, we wouldn't be able to close off that particular entity until we'd had some kind of outcome for the student. So to give you that sense that, you know, the start dates might relate more to the curriculum, the end dates might relate more to the student journey, because we do want students to be at the centre of this data collection. It's really important that we track each of those student journeys and have a full story to tell about each one of them. So we will be publishing the in-scope dates during the alpha phase. We're doing a lot of work to determine what those dates should be at the moment, and there will be an update in due course. I mentioned exception processing a couple of times. So historical amendments to provider data can occur through the operation of exception processing, and that's where data whose in-scope period has now passed is returned to HESA. And since those kinds of changes amend the historic record, they'll need to follow a procedure whereby there's an appropriate authorization path. And we'll determine what those appropriate paths are, but clearly it's slightly different. So if we've been told a certain state of affairs and then it turns out that actually something else was true, well, some kind of authorization is required in order to say, is this absolutely right, and can the historical record be amended? Is it appropriate to amend it? So in some cases that might be a manual or partly manual authorization path. In other cases perhaps it can be automated or at least semi-automated. It depends what the use cases are. So we will also do some more work on those, but clearly in some cases a judgment needs to be made about whether the data should be processed, and what HESA will be doing is coordinating that authorization path and ensure that any reopening of closed reference periods to enable exception processing to occur is sort of handled in a straightforward way and everyone understands what's going on in that process. So it's exception processing is, I know some people will be familiar with the current usage for that term, but we're using that term to refer to something along the lines of a replacement for what we think of as fixed database at the moment, but it's a new concept really. Let's talk about data submission behavior. So how does the kind of concepts that I've been talking about relate to the new world? So here's a diagram, and we've put it in boring grey to make sure that you're absolutely clear that this is the dull old way of doing things. You've got a number of systems in your provider, and you're extracting data from those and placing them in some kind of staging area. And from that staging area, you're making submissions, and that goes into HESA system, and there's a lot of whirring and clicking, and you get reports back to say what we think is right and not right about the data, and asking you questions to justify things that we don't understand. And that's an iterative process. That's the creation of that bucket of data. We're moving from a system aimed at producing one good version of a single file comprising a complete annual return to an ongoing update approach where fragments of data are accumulated and built towards a complete picture over time. So there's still a staging area, but the staging area doesn't have to be doing the same thing as in the past. So it could be sending very small pieces of data or very large ones. It depends really on the processes that you intend to follow and the systems that you've got in place. So fragments could be large files, and they could comprise your intended complete return for that reference period, or it could just be a very small correction, say adding a missing date of birth or giving some small update, and it depends on the approach that you want to take and you feel able to take, to what extent a fragment is a large file sent irregularly or a smaller file and sent more regularly. So that's sort of up to you. Our system will handle any kind of approach from a nightly upload of the entire file to small deltas to folks who are treating it very much in the same way that data is currently treated, as a sort of race to a finish line. So we encourage those moves towards smaller, more frequent updates, changes or deltas, but we recognize that different providers are on different paths towards that, and so we'll interact with the system in different ways. So that's in terms of the kind of behaviors that we anticipate seeing. There is quite a lot of difference there, but one thing is really clear: we're committed to the principle of collecting once and using many times, and that means that we only want to collect data where it's new, where it's changed, or where a correction is necessary. And so what that will give you the flexibility to do is to think about ways that you can send us less data rather than more, and to simplify your data submission processes. We want to enable you to have those conversations about how you can manage your data well. Okay, so that's quite a change. You've got the two models side by side there. They're quite different approaches to handling data. Data futures is a big change for the sector. It's a big change in terms of the data model and in terms of the processes. This is really the end of the key concepts part of the presentation. we recognise there's an appetite for more. We understand that you're going to want to see more information from us about the quality assurance approach, more detail on the data model, and that is coming. So during the alpha phase, you can expect to see the following things released on this still to come list. So we're going to be producing some scenarios that give you examples of data journeys indicating how an individual student case or a course might be returned in the model. We will be publishing at a later point the detailed collection schedule. Quick note on collection schedule: we put out, I think last week, an update giving the high level transition plan. I won't go into that in any detail now, but that's on the website, so do take a look at that. We've already published the collection schedule in terms of the reference periods, and I've read you those dates during the presentation. The dissemination points, that's still to be worked on, and that will come a little bit later once we've given that thorough testing. Guidance. We have a team here at HESA who are working iteratively on producing guidance for different parts of the model. So what you've seen from us so far is a detailed physical model. You've got very limited guidance within that. Essentially you've got the structure that's required to build your staging area to make sure you can get the data into the right shape to submit to HESA, but we know that you need all of that detailed guidance to work out how you're going to lift data from your business systems into that structure, and the guidance will be crucial to that. So that's coming. We're working on that now. We have to put that through a number of peer review quality assurance processes, and our intention is that we release that as and when it's ready. So there'll be sort of updates, probably the next big update in January, but if we can do anything before that, then we will. We are working on quality rules. We've got a team who are looking at all the kinds of rules that will be required in the new system and the metadata that we need to support that, and a whole range of other information. The in-scope dates I mentioned, we're working on those at the moment, and you can expect us to publish those in due course, and also derived fields. So far you've got from us a high-level view of what kinds of derived fields we anticipate creating. We're going to put some flesh on the bones of those and start working out the detailed specifications and publishing those. And we know that you'll want to know about credibility reports, wireframes of the kind of information that you can get out of the system, and that's coming as well, but that will be a little bit later on, but still during the alpha phase. So those are the things that we're working on. We are anticipating a fairly big update in January, as I said. We are communicating with all of those on the alpha group and asking them to help us test new ideas and the developments as we're working on them. So they are feeding in to that process, but we will be publishing more and more as we do more of the detailed data development work. I think that's probably enough for now. I think that's taken us up to 39 minutes. So I'm going to give myself a pat on the back for finishing 1 minute early in the presentation. We are going to give you a few minutes now to start thinking about the questions that you'd like to write in with, and give you just a moment to sort of cogitate on what you've heard and ask any questions, any clarifications that you would like. I'm going to turn the microphone off for just a moment and go and get myself a glass of water, and then I'll be right back, and myself and my colleagues who are arrayed around the table will be answering your questions. We've also had a few questions that have been sent in beforehand, so if you're shy, we can start off with those, and we'll do that in about 5 minutes time. So just a short moment for you to start that cogitation. We look forward to hearing from you a little bit more about what you'd like to hear next, or any clarifications. Hello, and we're back in the room, but with a different microphone. I've got some colleagues here with me, so I'm still Dan Cook, but my colleagues are going to introduce themselves briefly for this Q&A part of the session. Before we do that though, can I just check a show of hands, if you wouldn't mind, that our new microphone is not causing feedback or distortion for you? Would you mind putting your hand up if it's okay? Okay, I'm seeing lots of hands going up. Great, thanks very much for that. I'm going to assume that that's okay. So, I'm Dan Cook. My colleagues in the room with me are...
I'm Simon Robshaw, he's his data architect.
I'm Paul Barron, he's his business architect.
And I'm Laura Pert, and I work on the marketing side of data features.
Fantastic. And Laura's done an awful lot of the work to bring together the webinar and the presentation today. So thank you very much all. We've got a whole load of questions coming in. We're in no particular order. We're going to sort of start with the most recent ones. So let's see. Vicky Colborne, you've asked, can we have more information about the in-year and end-of-year for 2019-20 mentioned in a recent email? For these reasons, the 2019-20 return is likely to be an annual basis return, 12-month period collected once at the end of the year using the new coding manual with an additional mandatory in-year test return. Okay, so a bit more detail. Well, we're working on the detail of that. But essentially what we're anticipating and planning for is that in 1920 we will collect data using the new data specification as published, but we will collect that data at the end of what we've said is reference period 3 in a normal business as usual year. So we'll be collecting the whole year's data as a single annual collection at the end of that period. And the precise details of how that will work we're still working on, but the system should be able to cope with that. That gives some flexibility for providers in transitioning to an in-year based reporting schedule. So that is some flexibility that we're building in for that first year only. Is there anything else that we need to say about that? No. Yeah. And more details to come soon, I think. Okay, we've got related question, implementation. Is the implementation on target? Is it still realistic, says Claire Brooker? Yes, it is. You know, we've got a team working on all of this. We know there's a lot to do, but if you think about this in terms of the equivalent schedule for producing a normal system and coding manual, we're really quite a long way ahead of time. There are a lot of new things that need to be done, and we're not underestimating the scope and scale of the task, but if you think about our track record of doing the analogous work for an in-year collection, we've still got plenty of time to do that, and plenty of time to release through the alpha and beta processes and ensure that we're in good shape in 1920. That alongside the transition year where we're not going to be going straight into 1920 with a December collection effectively. That does sort of spread the load for institutions as well. So not only do we think we can be ready, but we think that can help you be ready as well. And of course we're talking to software providers throughout this process. Just going to roll up. I'm going to rely on my colleagues to shout if they think I'm answering the wrong questions or the less urgent ones. Colleagues, just so you know, Mark Jones, who I think I might have met, hello Mark, says that you're a bit quiet, so colleagues, can you speak up when you answer a question?
Yes.
Simon, you're not too bad by the sound of it.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, the text is quite small and we're trying to roll through quite a lot of questions. I think to give you some kind of idea, we've got, it looks like something in the order of about 30 or 40 questions. There's no way we're going to get through all of them today. So I think quite a substantial proportion are going to have to be chewed over by the team, and we'll have to do some kind of update on those.
if I go to so April Taylor, you've asked, will the staff return come into scope in the future, or will that continue as one yearly collection? Well, we haven't released any details about when we're going to be reviewing the staff record, but as you'll see, the logical model, the HE sector logical model, doesn't really work unless it's got staff data in it. So I think in the fullness of time it's inevitable that we'll bring staff data in, but that's not on our data development roadmap at the moment. Also, Eddie Barnes says, also the first reference point will be... Oh, no, I've lost your question, Ellie, by pressing the wrong part of my computer. Okay, another question from Ellie. You mentioned a few times in regards to the change to multiple in-year returns that this will smooth resources. What does this mean? From my experience of working on the HESA return, 6 separate HE institutions, I see it as increasing staff resources quite markedly. Do you want to hear someone else's voice than my own?
Yeah, okay, so I can try and answer this one. I think the idea is by having a sort of always on incrementally building system, the concept is that then you can kind of plan when that data is coming in a much more even fashion. So it's kind of the notion of once the data is generated, it can get sent across to HESA. HESA can then provide sort of quality assurance feedback on it. So it's a kind of a little and often approach to sort of feedback and quality assurance, rather than what we currently have now is we get to a point in time, we have a large collation exercise and then a fairly intensive quality assurance process leading up to sign off. So the idea is that what we can actually assist with is providing that sort of quality assurance and the building up of the picture over the full year rather than a fairly compressed time scale. And that's certainly the intention of what we're trying to go with that. I think the other side is it's obviously it's very predictable now, the resource requirements, because it's something that's been in place for a number of years. So there will no doubt be some kind of adjustment, and it's most likely that in the first couple of years, I think it's difficult to argue that immediately there'll be a sort of drop off in resource requirements, but the idea is that over time then that becomes a smoother, more even process rather than a really peaky sort of 2 or 3 times a year really intense set of activities.
So next question, Vicky Colborne, you've asked, the model shows validation after upload. Will there be a facility for validation prior to upload as the current process? And I think it's a straightforward answer, is yes. Yeah. Don't need to add anything to that. Yeah. Yes, there will be. Okay. Just to give you an overview, some people saying concerned about the shorter time frames for reference period 1, given high volumes of September enrolments. As I said, we're going to test this. We're not sure that that's absolutely right, but the principle of having more timely data is clearly going to put pressure on all of us to work in different ways. Jean Campbell, hello Jean, really useful, many thanks. You're keen to see more about the use of data, i.e. what's in scope at each reference period. Could this differ for different parts of the UK? The answer is could, and of course it could, though we are aiming to take as consistent an approach as possible across all of the UK's administrations, and all of the funding councils are committed to working together to harmonise as far as possible and have a simple and standard reporting process as possible. So the intention is no, even though theoretically that could happen. In terms of those in-scope dates, it's one of the first things that we're working on, so we'll publish that as soon as we've produced in-scope dates. We need to do a little bit more work before we can get those out, but we have some draft materials already on those, so more to come on in-scope periods. Mick Norman, hello Nick, how are you doing? Depending on the length of sign-off period, exam boards so close to the end of an in-scope period may not have results ready in time to submit. Are we looking at an exception submission in those scenarios? We would anticipate not. We will cover this in more detail in the quality assurance seminars that we're going to put some dates out for soon. Seminars, webinars, not entirely sure which, but we're going to do something on quality assurance in the new model, and we'll explain in detail how the in-scope periods and reference periods and sign-off processes interact with each other. But to just give you the high-level principle, when we're asking you to submit the data that you have, if you don't have the data yet, then we understand that it can't be submitted. Clearly there need to be sort of reasonable expectations about having timely processes that are intended to, you know, get students their results, and those same processes ought to be generating data that is essentially returnable to HESA. But we understand, you know, that sometimes dates are close. I guess what that means is that it falls into the next reference period, but we'll talk about how that interacts with the quality processes in another seminar. So thanks for that question. What else have we got here? Caroline Hinch, you've asked. You said they're obvious questions. I'm sure they're not, actually. In future, will we only be submitting a student once when they start a course, and then at various reference points provide updates on that student's progress? If they withdraw when they complete the qualification, we will no longer be submitting a whole record on a student each year. Is that correct, please? I think in essence that is correct.
In essence, that's absolutely correct. I mean, as Dan kind of alluded to in his presentation, one thing we don't want to force is data supply. So the notion could be very well that you could actually submit the whole record every year, if that was what was easier for you, and the Data Futures platform would effectively just strip out and process anything that it notices that's changed. But in essence, the model is designed as a transactional one, and therefore what we're kind of interested in is building that picture of data additions and changes and corrections over time. So yeah, absolutely. The idea is that you submit it once and then you let us know if it changes.
A counterpoint question from Zheng Xiang, who says, when HEPs start to submit the new in-year return, will they submit data in the entirety of the logical data model at each of the reference points? So I think the first thing to say is that even though everything that Simon said is true, clearly the whole model is in scope for every reference period. So if you think about a sort of, you know, some fairly usual type, you know, student on a 3-year degree, doesn't do anything terribly exceptional, then we could refer to Caroline's question just now. Having said that, complicated students who have, you know, lots of complicated curriculum taking patterns, or indeed institutions that have, you know, fairly complex kind of curriculum models, will sort of find that there is more data to return. So we can't give you an absolute sort of cast iron promise along the lines of you'll only need to return the course data once. If your course data is really complicated, you might need to return it more often. But for most providers, we know that course data tends to be fairly stable, and courses tend to, you know, be multi-year in nature and have a kind of annualized cadence. So essentially, the simpler your model, the simpler your data, the less often you're likely to have to return data to us. The more complex your model, it kind of increases the complexity of the data that needs to be submitted, and I think that's sort of, you know, unavoidable in a sense. But the precise question, will they submit data in the entirety of the logical model? They don't have to. They only have to return what's relevant. But if they choose to do so, or they feel they need to do so for technological reasons, then they could submit the whole model every night with, you know, essentially we would pick out the updates from it. We are close to time. I'm tempted, given there are so many questions, to carry on for a few minutes more, if that's acceptable to colleagues. Can we carry on for just perhaps 5 or 10 minutes, take a few more questions? Andrew Reynolds asks, where do degree apprenticeships fit within the scope of the current design? And the answer is that we have not explicitly built in a whole curriculum model that relates to degree apprenticeships. You will have seen that in previous versions. It's still there in the logical model, and we believe that that's accurate in the logical model. But the Data Futures programme has not prioritised the degree apprenticeships at this stage, and so degree apprenticeships will be primarily represented through a student initiative where you'll be able to signify which students are degree apprenticeship students, and then those who require the data can have that data sewn together in their systems. So it's not represented in there at the moment. Nora Stokes. Hello Nora. Are there plans to change the data linking with UCAS and the SLC for this design of return? We are talking to both of those organisations. Sorry, Simon.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, well, I mean, in some respects it's inevitable that they will have to change because we're moving to an in-cycle, kind of always-on, more transactional collection. The specific details of exactly what those data linkings look like is not yet known, but those conversations are kind of taking place.
I mean, it's important to note that Data Futures is just part of a coherent vision for an improved data landscape that HESA and the HEDIT programme before it has been instrumental in developing collaboratively with the sector, with institutions, but also with organisations like the SLC and UCAS. And so over time you can expect that we will be moving together to a more organised data landscape. So thank you for that question, Nora. April Taylor, you've asked, will resit information that occurs after a collection period be counted as out of scope? Our boards happen mid-September, then there is an appeal period, so we do not know if students are progressing until mid-October. Would this be out of scope as the activity it relates to has been returned already and may have needed to be signed off? So we're asking you to return the data that you have. If your exam board is outside of the reference period, then clearly it falls into the next reference period, and so the data becomes returnable in the next reference period. What we need to do is make sure that those student journeys are understood and that they're closed off. So it's not the case that there's a sort of, some people will have to return the data and others won't. Everyone needs to return the data about what the outcomes were when they happen. If your exam boards are after one reference period, they are, as a matter of course, they're going to be in the next reference period, and so that's when the data becomes returnable. So this is part of why the reference periods are not the same as a HESA reference year. So the HESA reference year is kind of saying we need to have chapter and verse on everything that happens over that whole period, and your processes will have to fit into it. In the new world, what we're saying is your curriculum has a rhythm. Your curriculum's rhythm may be different to the rhythm of another provider's curriculum. You may have different rhythms at play in your institution at any one time. So, the exam board for postgraduate students might be at yet another point in the year. And what that means is that the data should be returned in the reference period when the activity happens. So if it's in September, then it's in reference period 1. If it's in June or July, then it's in reference period 3. It's as simple as that. It's whenever the activity happens, that's when the data's due to be returned. Hopefully that's really clear. So we'll go into this more in the quality assurance process, but we're trying to follow your academic rhythm, not impose one on you. Let me see. It's 5 past, so I think if we just take one more question. I was going to say Jim, but you were struggling to hear us, Jim. I don't. Hopefully you can hear us now. Okay, Seth Hartley, you've asked, I'm concerned about the apparent lack of history in the coding manual, as you seem to suggest that as changes are made, the dictionary will be updated. This suggests that it may be tricky to find information as it drops out of scope or that it will become bloated with irrelevant information. And I think that's a fair challenge. We have plans for how we're going to handle that. So the coding manual that we've put out at the moment has been developed using a combination of HESA's existing technology for display of data, but new technology that has come in as part of the data futures work for developing the physical model, developing the data definitions, and storing them in our back end. So essentially you've got the old front end but a new back end, and what that means is that we're able to put out our coding manual that we're calling, the data futures, the 1920 spec. Before very long, we know we're going to have to come up with a number of things. So first of all, be able to display those changes, be able to refer unambiguously to a version of the spec, and refer unambiguously to a particular reference period, and we're working on what the terminology ought to be for those things. Once we've worked out the terminology, we're going to work out a reasonable way of displaying this. So it might be that the structure, the appearance, if you like, of the coding manual will change as we move through data futures. It's kind of the best that we can do at the moment, but we recognise that in a world where you've got multiple data specs, you need an easy way to navigate to what was the what's happening now, what's the latest, how do I understand what changes have been made, how can I find a particular spec for a particular period, how can I understand the consistency of a data item over longitudinal time in a longitudinal data set, how do I understand that data item hasn't changed meanings, and those things are partly about display, and they're also partly about having a good governance process. And as you're probably aware, we're doing a lot of work at the same time around improving HESA's approach to data governance. So those two things, better data governance and improved display functionality out of data futures, will answer that question. But I think it's a good challenge. We feel the risk in there as well, and we're actively pursuing a plan to improve the way we produce coding manuals in future. And I think with that note, we're going to have to call it a day. We've gone 8 minutes over, and you may well. Some people are dropping off the presentation already, so we'll call it a day. We've had more questions than we could possibly have answered. Thank you so much for your questions. We'll have a look through them afterwards, and we'll use them to inform our approach to further communications about this work, the data stream of data futures. But for the time being, I'd like to thank you, and I think all my colleagues would like to thank you for your time, for your questions, and we will speak to you soon and see you soon. Thank you.